Hello, class. This is part 2 of our series, Foundations of Literary Study. And the topic of this video is point of view. This corresponds to chapter 3 of the textbook, our textbook, Writing About Literature. So we'll start with an interesting quote from T.S. Eliot about voice. This quote comes from his essay, The Three Voices of Poetry, published in 1953. He wrote, "The first voice is the voice of the poet talking to himself or to nobody. The second is the voice of the poet addressing an audience, whether large or small. The third is the voice of the poet when he attempts to create a dramatic character speaking in verse, when he is saying not what he would say in his own person, but only what he can say within the limits of one imaginary character addressing another imaginary character." I'm using that quote as a segue into our discussion of point of view. When we read a story or a poem, there is always a voice selecting, framing, and interpreting the information we receive. Sometimes it is the voice of the author speaking directly to the reader, as Eliot observed, but other times it is the voice of a character, a fiction. Sometimes there are multiple voices competing for our attention in a single work. It is always important for the reader to ask, who is speaking here, and what do we know about him or her? When dealing with narrative, the term point of view, or sometimes viewpoint is another word that's commonly used. This describes the position of the speaker storyteller in relation to his story. Is the speaker involved in the action or outside of it? How much does the speaker know about what's going on? And while point of view is typically associated with narrative, one should always be attentive to the speaker's position in lyric poetry as well. So we'll talk about 5 points of view that are presented in our textbook. The first person point of view, the second person point of view, the objective point of view, the omniscient point of view, and the limited omniscient point of view. And those bottom 3 are all forms of the third person. So we'll start by talking about a first-person point of view, which can be quite complicated. First-person narrative presents unique problems for the reader, especially if the narrator happens also to be a character directly involved in the action of the story. In such cases, one has to consider the narrator's circumstances, relationships, and state of mind. His desires and aversions, his affinities and hostilities, all these factors will play a role in shaping the narrator's version of events. Oftentimes, these narrators are not entirely trustworthy. Unreliable narrators have motives and limitations that result in self-delusion, misdirection, and misrepresentation of facts. Oftentimes, it is simply a lack of self-awareness that makes a narrator unreliable. Writers sometimes adopt the voice of a fictional first-person speaker called a persona. When they do, it is not always immediately apparent to the reader, and this can lead to critical errors in judgment and interpretation. In some cases, this trickery is deliberate, so careful readers will always ask questions before assuming that the speaker in a story or poem is the writer himself. Once a persona has been detected and identified, the reader then has to consider the reasons behind it. Why is the writer using a persona? Why is the writer hiding behind a mask? So, second person point of view is more common in certain forms of lyric poetry. where there is an addressee, say, for example, in a Petrarchan sonnet. When the writer uses the second person pronoun you, the reader must determine the identity not only of the poetic voice, but also the addressee, who, like the speaker, may be a figment of the writer's imagination. Objective point of view. The objective, it's sometimes also called the dramatic point of view, confines readers' knowledge to what characters say and do. This point of view does not give us access to thoughts and emotions. Narrators in this point of view remain largely invisible and avoid interpreting or commenting on the action. We'll talk more about objective point of view a little later. Omniscient point of view. This point of view, by contrast, not only describes what characters say and do, but it also gives readers access to their interior lives, to their hopes, fears, desires, prejudices, and so forth. This is the most common form of third-person narrative. And then the limited omniscient point of view. The limited omniscient narrator confines readers to the experiences of a single character or perhaps a small group of characters, but not all of the characters. While readers inhabit the interior world of that character, access is denied to the interior spaces of other characters. So limited omniscient point of view. Omniscient narrators sometimes interject their own thoughts and opinions. So this can happen with the omniscient point of view or the limited omniscient point of view. They can interpret events or pass judgment on what characters say or do, and these things often slip by a reader very easily. So you really have to pay attention look for this to happen. When it does, these are called intrusive narrators, and they raise the same kinds of questions as the persona. Is the narrator to be identified with the writer himself, or is the narrator a kind of character, though perhaps removed from the world of the story, with beliefs and values that are distinct from those of the writer? So whichever point of view a writer adopts, as you could see just from the short overview I gave you, you will have to decide to what extent the speaking voice can be trusted, what motivates the speaker, what factors shape his understanding and portrayal of the world around him. Is there any reason for the reader to doubt the fullness and truthfulness of what he tells us? Never take what you read at face value. So, at this point, we're going to talk about point of view in Shakespeare's Macbeth. Lovely castle for us. When it comes to point of view, a drama raises problems that are distinct from most poetry and prose fiction. So, for example, most contemporary plays do not have a narrative voice that mediates between the audience and the stage. Ancient Greek and Roman plays, and sometimes later plays too, like Romeo and Juliet comes to mind, have a chorus that comments on the action. But most contemporary plays don't have that narrative voice that comments on the action for the audience. And in most plays, the audience is not involved in the action on stage. Typically, we experience the third-person objective point of view when we're watching a play. We hear the actors talking, we see what they do on stage, but we must rely almost entirely on verbal and visual cues to understand what's happening inside their heads. And a really good example of this in Macbeth is, of the objective viewpoint, that is the sleepwalking scene, Lady Macbeth's sleepwalking scene, which is observed by two other characters. The gentlewoman, some kind of lady in waiting, I suppose, and the doctor, and Richard Westall's picture. Here on the left, you can see them in the background, and they're watching Lady Macbeth. And when we read this scene or see it performed, she walks on the stage. She's wringing her hands. and she's muttering things that are incomprehensible to the doctor and the gentlewoman. Out damned Spot, and although the doctor finds her behavior suspicious, he says unnatural deeds do breed unnatural troubles. Neither he nor his companion, the gentlewoman, understand the full significance of her actions. What's behind what she's doing. But as an audience or as a reader, we do understand because we have witnessed her actions in prior scenes. Otherwise, we would be just as lost as they are, watching Lady Macbeth descend into her madness. This objective viewpoint poses a problem for the playwright who wants to disclose a character's thoughts to the audience without anyone else hearing. The character must speak aloud to communicate, but do so in a way that keeps other characters in the dark. And one common way playwrights accomplish this is with the short aside. The character turns away, and this aside will be you'll see it in written into the script. There'll be a little parenthetical, it says aside. The character might turn away from the other characters and deliver a line or two in perhaps a more inward or private register. But one of the more obvious strategies is to simply evacuate everyone from the stage except for the character, who delivers a longer speech revealing the inner workings of his or her mind. Because the character is alone on stage at this point, speaking to himself, and we're in the audience sort of overhearing this, these speeches are called soliloquies. You may be familiar with that term. And we have some really good examples of these in Scene 5 of Act 1. This is right after Lady Macbeth reads a letter from her husband telling her of the witch's prophecy. Actually, this scene has two soliloquies. They are separated by the appearance of a messenger. The first soliloquy starts at line 14. Actually, I think it's line 18. And it begins with Glam, thou art Cawdor, and it continues through line 20, line 29. Let me check my lines real quick. It's lines 14 to 29. In this soliloquy, she worries that Macbeth is too full of the milk of human kindness, she says, to go through with the murder of Duncan that she's contemplating this point. And then a messenger comes in to announce that Duncan is coming to their castle at Inverness. And then the messenger leaves and she's alone again. And then we get another soliloquy. And this one is pretty terrifying, actually. And it includes her famous lines, "Come to my woman's breasts and take my milk for gall, you murdering ministers." As I mentioned, this scene 5 of Act 1, it starts with her reading a letter from Macbeth. And that letter describes his encounter with the witches earlier in Act 1. And that would be lines 1 through 13 of our edition. This gives an interesting example of some of the problems that come with first-person point of view. Macbeth is telling his wife what happened to him, but some of his details don't quite line up with what actually happened back in Scene 3. Most importantly, most obviously and most importantly, he makes no mention of Banquo, or the prophecy that Banquo's descendants would one day occupy the throne of Scotland. This is like a pretty important detail, and it becomes very important later in the play. This information is absolutely crucial to what happens in Act 3, and he makes no mention of it in his letter to Lady Macbeth. So there is an example of, why would he not want to tell her about that? An interesting question. So the stories that we read, the story and the poem that we read for this, we read two stories this week. But for this discussion, I want you to think about Poe's story, The Fall of the House of Usher,
and then Browning's poem, My Last Duchess.
what point of view is used in The Fall of the House of Usher and My Last Duchess? What do you know about the speakers in both of these works? And what signs does Poe give the reader that the narrator of his story is not to be trusted? Are there clues that some of what he tells us happened maybe didn't really happen at all? In Browning's poem, what does the Duke of Ferrara unwittingly reveal about himself in his meeting with the emissary of his future bride? So here are some questions for you to think about ahead of our discussion this week.
And with that, I will conclude this video on point of view.